So originally I was just going to do the video on George and only George, but I'm also doing some Kubrick stuff, and I think the parallel is pretty amazing, and the basic issue is still the same, namely that we have artists that, at least early on, seem to be very, very productive, but as we get into their later years, the amount of time they spend per project keeps getting longer and longer and longer. You look at something like 2001 and Clockwork Orange, and Kubrick got those things out in like 2 to 3 years. And now suddenly it becomes 5 years, 7 years, 11 years with The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, and Eyes Wide Shut. And with George, as we well know, that he did the early novels like Fever Dream, Dying, Sandkings, these novellas in pretty short amount of time. Armageddon Rag, it's only 1, 2, 3 years between projects, and then now it's 4 or 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 11 years, 12 years. It's an insane amount in terms of lengthening. After Storm of Swords, the books really come out only in 5, 6, and now about, 12 years? Count? It's depending on where you date where he begins or probably ended. The lengths have gotten much, much larger. So the question is why? And I want to analytically answer the question, but I'll do a more expanded thing on George particularly because I'm a writer. And though Kubrick did a lot of screenplays, he always wanted to be a director, and he was just forced to do screenplays. But he became much more of a co-writer later on, preferring to work and collaborate with others. So I'm going to go through it in 3 steps, which I think kind of answer the question. One is, how do these people style themselves? And I think you have to come to terms with, and again, they may not be, but in terms of how they think of themselves, and this is pretty clear over and over again in interviews, George and Stanley Kubrick do think of themselves as artistic. Though George does a lot more genre stuff, he has always considered himself an artist. He doesn't consider the two separate. Being a genre writer and being an artist are the same thing. So as artists, they have special rights and privileges, and one of them is to do the work on their timetable. Now, obviously, if extreme financial pain essentially will force them to be more productive, then they'll do it. And that brings us to the second point, which is kind of like the Hollywood myth. That yes, in their early Hollywood careers, whether we think Kubrick, late 50s, early 60s, they pumped out a lot of stuff, right? Whether it's The Killing, Spartacus, Lolita, and with George, doing stuff with The Twilight Zone, Beauty and the Beast, and tons of stuff that never got produced, pilots, screenplays. He was writing a lot, and he wanted to write even more. He almost worked for Star Trek at one point. So when they had to financially do it, they had no choice, then yeah, they had to be productive. You have to work within a schedule, within a contract, and the production company will sue you if you don't put it in time. So they didn't really have a choice. In terms of their, financially needy period in Hollywood, yeah, they put out stuff. Whether they wanted to was not a question. They just did it. But as they became both more wealthy, more well-known, they took a step back and said, well, in terms of this or that work, I can do this really quickly, but this other work, and I really want to do it, is going to take a lot longer. Even with George, in terms of the main novels, he does books within A Song of Ice and Fire, just not the main saga books. He does other books, just not Game of Thrones books. Kubrick did a lot of film stuff even when he didn't actually commit himself as a director. He kept looking for projects, kept working on screenplays. They just never got finished or realized. So it's just because the thing is not published or not actually put out to the public does not mean they're not working on things. They are working on things. They're just not working on what the audience wants them to work on. And I think that's where the disjunction comes into play. And then finally we have the third myth, which is the Stephen King factor, which is that, Stephen King manages to pump out a huge amount, both in terms of films, in terms of books, screenplays. He's very active on all these fronts, and his productivity is insane, right? He's written about 62 novels, depending on your count. He probably wrote total 64, 65, and then we add nonfiction, about 70 books. It's an insane amount of productivity. However, if you look at the numbers much more carefully and break it down much more analytically, he's really not all that fast. He's fast towards the average person, to George Martin or Kubrick. But if you look at him more objectively, like somebody like James Patterson has over 140 books published, and a lot of those are probably not him. He probably only wrote a little bit of it, but he's like a book machine. He just publishes and puts out a huge number of books. And of course, the problem is the quality is a little questionable. So yeah, you can put out a lot of stuff, but whether it's good or bad is questionable. And I think Steven is sort of like moderate. He puts out a lot of stuff that is not good, a lot of stuff that is good. It's a little bit mixed all over the place. But George and Kubrick are just putting themselves in such an insane standard. They want these films, these books, these stories to be the best ones in the universe. They want them to be the best, most classic, most resounding works that have ever existed. I think that level of pressure is insane. And I think that's where we wanted to end off the commentary, is that if these people were not artistic, if they were not going for, the best projects, I think, yes, some of the anger would be justified. But I have my own preferences. I mean, I personally consider George's early work, like Kubrick's early work, a lot stronger. And so those have to be where the books came out regularly. So I think Fever Dream is his best work. I think with Kubrick, The Killing, The Shining, or Barry Lyndon is some of his best work, but that's already been done. And the wait period, if you were even in that time period before I was born, isn't that long. Yeah, okay, you have to wait a little bit for Lolita or Dr. Strangelove, but it's only a couple years. Fever Dream is going to take a while, but we have to be sensitive to the actual empirical record, which is that, Paths of Glory and The Killing did not make money. That forced Kubrick to change his tactics. The Armageddon rag just destroyed George as a writer for a long time. He just could not be a novelist. He had to do Hollywood stuff. He had no choice. So I think we have the issue here that when artists have choices, they're going to make choices that people just don't like. But I would agree that if this material was one I was invested in, I would be as angry as many fans are. But I kind of consider the later works, whether Eyes Wide Shut or now A Song of Ice and Fire, just to be sort of middling works. So I'm curious to see what would be a completed version of these stories. I would really love to see more footage from Eyes Wide Shut, how he would have edited it, just like I do want to see the last final books. But ultimately, I'm less invested, so I'm more puzzled by the anger. Because even if, all we have is now Eyes Wide Shut or an incomplete book series, they're still pretty good works, and we have enough information to tell more or less what the narrative is, although we'll always be arguing what the exact meaning of the narratives are. Well, we have enough to say, we think strongly this is what the narrative is, but what the exact message is will forever be debated. So I'm of two minds. I do think if the works were perhaps better or more personally, resonate with me, I would be more angry. But as I see it, I don't believe the new deadline with George that it's going to come out in July in 2020. That's insane. Or even August 2020. We're not going to get Winds of Winter for a while, but I guess I'm I'm okay with it. I'm at peace with it because, again, the standard both he and Kubrick keep setting for themselves is so high, and they do seem serious about it, that I do understand why they're taking a time. So this is sort of covering the pro side of why they're taking time. I will do a more analytic essay on the con side that, they're being sort of stuck in their own head. This is not enough them being artists. They should be responsive to the audience. I mean, the fans made them rich, etc., etc. But I think on the pro side, as a writer myself, I do understand if you do consider yourself an artist and you want a high standard for the work, it's going to sometimes take a while, maybe 5, 10, 15 years. I mean, I have stories in my head that I have, from when I was a kid 25 years ago. So it may seem insane to people who are not writers, but if you do consider yourself an artistic writer, you have those moments where you have stories that are from 10, 20 years ago and you're still working on them. It sounds crazy, but it is really true. All right, this has been GRRM Analyzed on the WoW controversy, or Winds of Winter, and when it's coming out, and the official announcement that it is coming out July 2020, but I don't think it's going to happen. Okay, this has been GRRM and Thrones Analyzed. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.